member of the Forum Committee that organizes these platforms for the discussion of significant issues, especially those that involve ethical values in the contemporary world. Now is the time to turn off your phone, and I realize I have forgotten mine. For the entire program, FYI, we are being recorded for in-church use and for probable broadcast on KKFI. Our forum speaker this morning is John Fish Kurmann. Many of you already know him. John is Kansas City's very own Sisyphus, pushing, struggling to get information out there, to get enthusiasm out there, to get understanding out there for many changes that need to come. Finally, a little bit of progress is being made. John Kurmann.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this chilly morning to hear what I hope will ultimately be a talk that energizes you to act. So when thinking about Rita invited me, I didn't have a topic to talk about, that I came to the Forum Committee and said, let me talk, but Rita invited me and said, well, you decide what you want to talk about. And it actually didn't take very long for me to come up with my title. What have we got to lose? Quite frankly, what we have to lose is everything we hold dear. Literally everything we hold dear. We in the industrialized world, we of this global civilization, are in the process of shredding the web of life that makes all life possible, of wiping out our relatives in the community of life, species by species by species. We do this in multiple ways, of course. The most pressing manifestation of our war on the world is global warming, of course, where we are jacking around with one of the basic life support systems of the planet that made life as we know it possible, literally. By overheating the planet, we are changing the fundamental conditions on which all life depends. It sounds small when we talk about 2 or 3 or 4 degrees Celsius of warming. But when you look at it in the perspective of the entire planet, the amount of heat energy it takes over the entire planet, the depths of the ocean, the atmosphere, to warm the planet by that is immense. It's an immense amount of energy we are in the process of adding. Now, the most catastrophic consequence of our war on the world is the mass extinction that we're causing. Biologists tell us that we are in the process of causing what they refer to as the 6th extinction. The geological record shows 5 periods of mass extinction in the past, the last one being the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs some 66 or so million years ago. And they say we're in the process of causing another one, that if we keep going the way we're going, and that's an essential phrase, if we keep going the way we're going, we will wipe out half of all existing species over the next 100 years, something like half of all existing species. Now, this is one of my pet peeves. When they talk about extinction, they say, this species could go extinct, or this species did go extinct. It's an oddly passive phrasing. They didn't just go extinct. They were driven to extinction. They were driven to extinction by us, and I will be talking more about how that happens. And of course, it's not just impacts on the community of life, other species. It's impacts on our own species, the mass migrations that have already begun in response to climate change. One of the drivers of increased migration from Central America to the United States, which has been in the news a little bit lately, is climate change due to global warming. And it's just a tiny taste of what's to come if we keep going the way we're going. Migration due to rising sea levels, migration due to failing water supplies as the glaciers atop the Himalayas and other mountain ranges melt and no longer are there, providing a regular supply of water to everyone downstream. Hundreds of millions, billions of people dependent on the runoff from those glaciers. Droughts that cause crop failures. Wars over insufficient water, lack of food. We are literally looking not at just mass extinction of other species, but I'm convinced at least some level of die-off in the human species from our current population level of about 7.5 billion. I don't think we're going to save everyone. But we can make a difference in how much we lose. I want to take a moment for you to just sit with that pit in your stomach that I feel every day, that it's too late to make everything all right. We've waited too long. My generation. I'm on the leading edge of Generation X, the baby boomers. What was the preceding generation? The silent generation? I'm not sure why they were called that. We have all failed to act in time. And now it's a question of mitigating how bad things will get, I'm afraid. Sit with that in your stomach. It's going to grow. The sense of loss, grief. Slide. So let's look at a little history. I have an emotional connection to this figure here that shows human population growth spanning from the beginning of our genus, essentially, all the way up through projected 2025. This was published by an organization called the Population Reference Bureau in 1994, which is the year I got serious about activism. So I've been at this seriously for about 25 years now. As you can see, there's slow growth there. Our species, not just our genus, but our species, Homo sapiens, is thought to, based on the evidence, have evolved to into existence somewhere between 300 to 200,000 years ago. Of course, we don't know exactly when, but something like that. And our population numbers did certainly grow as our ancestors spread out around the world. But they grew pretty slowly as we moved into new environments, adapted through cultural evolution and our technologies to live in ways that other species weren't capable of doing. They had to rely on anatomical evolution in order to move into new areas, new habitats. So our population grew slowly from our origins some 200,000 plus years ago, up to the time of the agricultural revolution. Nobody knows for sure, of course. Estimates range from a low of maybe 1 million total human beings at the time of our agricultural revolution, beginning about 10 to 12,000 years ago, up to as high as 10 million. Well, let's just go with 5 million, halfway in between. Now, agriculture, it's often talked about, when it's talked about in history books, as if it's something that all of humanity took up 10 to 12,000 years ago. This is, of course, not how it happened. Agriculture arose independently, maybe in 7 different centers around the world, and spread outward from those centers as the populations of those agriculture practicing societies grew, and frankly displaced, wiped out the hunter-gatherer surrounding societies that surrounded them, took over their land and put it under agriculture. Agriculture produces population growth because it allows you to wring more food out of the land than hunting and gathering does. So on average, year after year, it produces growth. Now, of course, the downside of agriculture is that it narrows your food supply and settles you in a place and ties you to a place so that if there are conditions that change, you're not easily able to pick up and move someplace where there is food. And so the problem with agriculture is that you produce more food than you need when conditions are really good, but when conditions are terrible, then you don't produce enough food and you starve. And sometimes societies have collapsed in the regional level because of that. And it still happens, though not in the industrialized world so much. So again, about 5 million people, we'll say, at the beginning of our agricultural revolution. The population continued to grow and will grow more quickly now than it had before. Slide. By the time we get to the Common Era, dating the year 0, the population is estimated to have grown to about 300 million people. So we're talking maybe 10,000 years to grow from 5 million to 300 million people under agriculture. Much more rapid growth than had occurred previously. The next milestone that I want to point to, and I find it kind of funny that they pin it down this tightly, but demographers who have studied this generally say that we hit the 1 billion mark in the year 1804. So that's 1,804 years to go from 300 million to 1 billion. Notice the accelerating growth. So 1804, I don't want to just have numbers here though. So as I was thinking about how to do my talk, I decided I wanted to put it in human terms, in terms of my own family line. My great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Merkel, was born in 1846 in what is now Germany, although it wasn't a unified nation at the time. Somehow she made her way to the same part of Illinois that I am from, not too far from St. Louis. And she married a man named George Hotz. At the time she was born, the population was around 1.2 billion. This is 1846 again. Among her children was Mary Hotz, born in 1865, the same year the Civil War ended. Around then, we were getting closer to 1.3 billion. She married a man named Anton. And among her children was Adela Winnicke, born in 1891. By then, we're up to almost 1.6 billion. Among her children was Irene Wieth, my grandmother. Irene was born in 1918, when the population was almost 1.9 billion. In 1927, the demographers tell us we hit 2 billion. So this is 123 years to go from 1 billion to 2 billion. In 1941, my mother, Irene's daughter, Mary Ann Kurmann, was born. By then, the population was 2.3 billion. My mom's not here, so I can tell you what year she was born. Once we get into the 50s, people are beginning to notice the impacts of all of this growth. They're starting to worry about it. We get to 1960, when the world's population hit 3 billion. Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, 1962. Major cities shrouded in smog. Growth. 1965 is the year I was born. Population then was about 3.3 billion. So between the time my mother was born in 1941 and the time I was born in 1965, the population grew by about 1 billion. And just to put it in perspective, people often think of the United States as a country without a population problem. Our population in the United States at the time I was born was 194.3 million. Keep that in mind. 3.3 billion worldwide, 194.3 million in the US. In 1974, we hit 4 billion. And people are really beginning to worry in this interim period here when I'm just a little kid. The Population Bomb was published in 1968. Paul Ehrlich, an organization called Zero Population Growth, was founded. Their antecedent, now called Population Connection, is where this slide came from. If some of you may remember, Paul Ehrlich was actually on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson talking about this issue back in the day. So 4 billion in 1974. I'm 9 years old. 5 billion in 1987. I'm 22 years old. I'm starting to worry about things. It gets to 1994, as I said, when I got serious about an activist, and how that happened, as I remembered anyway. Memory's a funny thing, but I'm pretty sure somehow or another I just got a mailing out of the blue from Zero Population Growth telling me about this issue, and of course wanting me to join their organization, which I did. And I was already a vegan at the time, and I was doing some little bit of activism on food issues, but this got me seriously interested in the issues of population growth and consumption growth, the other side of that. 1999 is the year of 6 billion, when the world's population hit 6 billion. 2011, just 12 years later, 7 billion. See again the acceleration in the pace at which we're going. Another billion, another billion. The world's current population, 7.5 billion. The current U.S. population, 328.8 million, according to the Census Bureau. So that's a growth of about 134 million in the U.S. population since I was born. And that's a growth from 3.3 billion to 7.5 billion in the time I've been alive, 53, almost 54 years. I have lived through well more than a doubling of the world's population. And of course, it's projected to go on. Now, of course, there are multiple factors that have caused this growth. Improvements in sanitation, vaccines, modern medicine. But at root, the fundamental cause is increases in food production. Because after all, people are made from food. You can't make more people if you don't first make more food, because it's the only thing you can make people out of. Increases in food production fuel population growth. Now, what explains the acceleration in growth, particularly over this century? Again, 2 billion, 1927, 7.5 billion today. Well, it's largely due to the fact that we are on the outer surface of a carbon bubble, a fossil fuel bubble. The increases in food production are primarily due to the available energy, the vast excess energy that we were able to access out of fossil fuels, and most importantly, oil for fuel to run machines and irrigation systems, natural gas for nitrogen fertilizers. So we are, in a sense, made out of petroleum-derived food. Now, as I said, the growth is expected to continue. Right now, they're estimating the world's population is growing by 82, 83 million people every single year. The United Nations figures we're going to hit 8.1 billion in 2025, 9.8 billion in 2050, and 11.2 billion in 2100. Now, of course, this is all speculative. It's based on projections of current trends and how things are expected to change. I think we'll probably make the 8.1 billion in 2025. That's not that far off. I don't think there's any way we're going to get to the 9.8 or the 11.2. This issue is often conceived of, will we be able to grow enough food to feed 10 billion people? Which is precisely the wrong way to conceive of this. The danger is not that we won't be able to grow enough food to feed 10 billion people. The danger is that we will be able to grow enough food for 10 billion people for a while, because that's the only way we'll get to 10 billion people. And then we will start failing to grow enough food for 10 billion people. And what happens when people don't have food? Of course, the numbers of population growth are only one side of this. The economic growth we have experienced because of fossil fuels primarily, because energy underlies everything, has been even more dramatic than the growth in our numbers of the population, vastly more. And so we have this way of life now where a certain small percentage of the world's population consumes in immense amounts, but a very large percentage of the population consumes more than the world can sustain. Slide. There's a measure called Ecological Footprint. Every couple of years, an organization, well, I hope you can read that, called the World Footprint Network, publishes a report that talks about how much we are in overshoot of the Earth's capacity to sustain life. Their most recent report says that over the course of a year, we use the equivalent of 1.7 Earths worth of resources. So we're using more than the world can sustain over time, than can be generated by the world over time. That's 1.7 Earths worth of resources. They have a tool they use to show this called Earth Overshoot Day, the point during the course of the year at which we go into overshoot, at which we've already used all that the Earth can produce for the year. Last year it was August the 1st. Now, that's bad enough. Globally, we're using 1.7 Earth's worth of resources. But of course, our economic system, this capitalist beast, is based on the presumption of ever-increasing consumption, of exporting the American way of life to the world. Well, look at that. How many Earths do we need to support the entire world's population at U.S. consumption levels on average? 5. That can't happen. That won't happen. Not even if we're more efficient. Not even if we use clean energy. That is a model that can't work. So think about this. How much longer can this go on? How much longer can we add 1 billion people every 13 or 14 years to the world's population? How much longer can we keep expanding our economic growth, our consumption of resources? Our economic system is based on this notion of perpetual growth. Well, perpetual growth, as someone famously said, is the creed of the cancer cell. And what does cancer do if it goes on growing and growing and growing? It kills the body of which it is a part. We have this notion that growth is by definition good. It doesn't even have to be stated overtly. When economic numbers come out from the government, the only two questions are, did the economy grow? And if so, did it grow enough? Almost no one asks, is the growth that happened good for us? Should the economy have grown the way it did? What were the effects of that growth? Is growth always good? Obviously, there are some things we need to grow, but there are a lot of other things we need to shrink, reverse. So what is there to do in this situation that we have gotten ourselves into because we have waited too long to act? We have failed to act. If you came here expecting a full-blown plan with all the details laid out, I will disappoint you. No one has all the answers. But Daniel Quinn, most famously the author of Ishmael, although my favorite book of his is The Story of B, taught me something really important that I think we all need to understand at root. Cultures are driven by stories. Cultures live stories. They have a vision of their place, of their purpose, of what life is about. The culture we are part of, and I am speaking very broadly here, this culture essentially encompasses all of global civilization now. has a story that says, the world is ours. It belongs to us. We can do with it whatever we want. We can take as much of it for ourselves as we want. We don't really have to worry about any other species unless we find them useful. We can wipe them out. We can take as much of the life-giving capacity of the world for ourselves as we want. That's the sort of self-aggrandizing portion of our story. But there's another part of our story which says, yeah, but people are fundamentally flawed. No matter how hard we try, we're going to screw it up. People are selfish and greedy and short-sighted and destructive by nature. So we'll never get it right. We're just going to keep screwing it all up. That story has to change if we're to have any hope of turning things around. Not making everything all right, but preventing things from going all wrong. We need a story that says not that the world belongs to us, but that we belong to the world. We are the world's. We got it backwards. We also need a story that recognizes something else Daniel Quinn taught me. We are not humanity. We look at the way we behave in our culture, and we imagine this is humanity's fundamental nature. And so we think because we keep screwing it up, that human beings will always keep screwing it up, that nothing else is possible. We look at ourselves and see that we live in a way that destroys the world, and imagine that that's just the way human beings are. They're just going to live in a way that wrecks the world, and maybe God will save us, or something, aliens, whatever you believe in, will come in and rescue us, or maybe we won't be rescued at all. We'll just go on this way until we screw it all up. But there always have been, and there still are, human cultures which do not live in a way that destroys the world. They are consigned to the most remote parts of the world where we haven't found something we want to extract and exploit and make money off of now, yet. But they do still exist. I am asking you to do something that might seem completely unreasonable. I'm asking you to believe in people, to believe in humanity, to believe in our capacity to be farsighted and generous and creative rather than destructive. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe those cultures that aren't living in a way that destroys the world just for one reason or another haven't figured out how to do it, and they would if they could. Maybe. But what have we got to lose by believing we can change? Because as long as we assume this is just human nature, we're going to go on like this. I mean, I might do something different, but all those other selfish people are just going to go on doing the same way. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm asking you, yes, in a Unitarian Universalist church, to take a leap of faith. What does it mean in concrete terms to stop destroying the world? Well, probably the first and foremost thing we have to do is end this food race, this sort of arms race between increasing food production under the idea that we have to end world hunger and grow enough food to feed 10 billion people, and the population growth that it fuels. And this actually shouldn't be that hard, because we got people employed all over the world working hard to keep increasing food production. Well, we could put them to work on something else. There is enough food to feed all the people we have now. People who are going hungry now, ask any of the folks who study this, they're not hungry because there's not enough food being produced. They're hungry because they can't grow their own, and they don't have the money to buy it because you have to buy it. We have to give up this notion that growth is inherently good. And we have to talk about that. It's heresy in our culture, but we have to start talking heretical ideas. Growth is not inherently good. One point in our favor is that our economy, this consumerist society we have built up, isn't making people happy. If people were happy, would so many of us be using drugs, illegal or otherwise, just to get through every day? Would our rates of depression and anxiety be so high? Would we have mass shootings? Would we have high rates of suicide? This consumer economy that grew up because businesses had more capacity to produce stuff than we were buying sets out to convince us that you're never good enough the way you are. You never have the right clothes, the right car, your hair's bad, you smell bad, your teeth are bad. You need our product to fix you. Our whole advertising economy, which serves the interests of the producers, is a perpetual dissatisfaction machine. It always wants us to keep feeling like we lack, like we're not good enough, that we need improvement. What we need to be looking at is not what we have to give up to save the world, which is the way it's often framed. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we're going to keep living the same way we do. Some things we will have to stop doing, to be sure. But what we need to focus on is what we have to gain by saving the world. Because what our culture doesn't give us, it gives us a lot of stuff and a lot of distractions. But what it doesn't give us is a sense of belonging, of community, of meaning, of purpose, of the things that actually make people happy. It doesn't want us to have those because we aren't going to buy all the stuff if we have those. This is not a conspiracy. This is just all a bunch of self-interested businesses trying to sell their stuff. But it has the effect of being a conspiracy. We need to come together. Stop thinking individualistically. We have this hyper-individualistic society in the United States. We can only deal with this not by individual lifestyle changes, although I support those by all means. The most important effect of those, though, is how they shape the social climate, not the direct impacts of your individual lifestyle changes. We need a mass movement. Only a mass movement has any hope of turning things around while there's still time. We need to show up when there's a rally, when there's a protest, when there's a talk. We need to get in the game. We need to be disobedient when the time is right for it. We need to be prepared to engage in peaceful civil disobedience. We need to disrupt the current way of doing things strategically when it makes sense. I'm sure what I'm talking about to you does not sound realistic. Well, I'm asking you to be unrealistic. Because realism is going to get a lot of living beings killed. Because, you know, even catastrophe comes in degrees. In the case of global warming, they're literal degrees. Every degree of global warming that we are on track to cause now, every fraction of a degree of global warming that we are on track to cause now, that we avert by what we do from this moment forward, matters. Every fraction of degree of warming that we avert will save untold lives. It won't save every life. It's too late for that. Even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions this moment, more warming is locked in because of the physics of the atmosphere. It's just the way things work. Don't have time to go into that. But every bit we do will save untold lives. To put this in more personal terms, let's say you got a call right now that said everyone you know and love was in mortal danger, and there was only so much time to act. and you knew it wasn't enough time to save them all, would you throw up your hands and not try to save any of them? Or would you do everything it was within your power to do to save as much, as many as you could? That's what's left to do when it's too late to make everything all right. Save as much as you can. Thank you.
Wow. Would the ushers begin taking the collection for the church? Please remember the rules for questions. Come to the mic to ask your question. One question per person until everyone has had an opportunity to ask a question. And please, no speeches. We will have some conversation time after 11 back in the library. Also, please speak clearly and into the microphone. Jeff.
Even though the candidates for president have barely, if at all, touched on issues of global warming and survival of the species and so on, there's been a fair amount of public attention to the issue of immigration and migrants, especially from Central America. Could you go into a little bit of the detail about how you see this developing over a period of time? How did this develop, and how did we get to that point that these people are willing to risk their lives and their families' lives just to make it to the U.S. border?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm by no means an expert on migration, so I would probably be foolish to try to talk in too much detail about it. But to go to what you said there at the end is a really important point in and of itself. Imagine what it takes to pick up from the only home you've ever known, the only life you've ever known, with your kids, and set off on what you know is a potentially deadly trek across land you don't know, to a place you don't know, where you don't speak the language. Imagine how bad things must have gotten to take that kind of risk. My understanding is that there have been issues with rainfall, changes in rainfall patterns in Central America, and so people are not able to produce enough food. Obviously, there are other factors. There's never a single cause for anything, is there? Crime, drugs, which is a whole other issue of our war on drugs and the follow-on effects of that for the people who live in the places where the drug gangs are producing the stuff. But the climate change part of it is, my understanding, has to do with food production shortfalls and people just not seeing how they can sustain their families anymore in these remote areas in Central America. And it's not just in Central America. Those are the folks who are coming to our borders, but it's happening all around the world in other places. There have been analyses which say that a prolonged drought in Syria was a major factor in the Syrian civil war, which has produced so many refugees, most of them in the Middle East, so they're out of our sight, out of our mind now, because we're just not paying attention. But those refugees are still displaced. They're still suffering. And it's playing out. It's often said, and this is absolutely true, the people who have contributed the least to creating the climate crisis are the ones who are suffering first and most. Right now, Mozambique is being battered by the second tropical cyclone this year. They've never been hit in recorded history anyway by two cyclones in a single year. The province, I think it's Cabo Delgado, I was reading about it this morning, that was hit by Cyclone Franklin, I think is the name of it, just now, had never been hit by a cyclone before. This is unprecedented. Two hitting Mozambique in 1 year, and one hitting a province that is out of an area that is normally hit by a cyclone at all. And tremendous devastation there. Yes?
When you speak of, as I'm sure you must in some presentations, about the solutions, do you include female literacy and women's equality as a means of addressing the population growth?
I absolutely think that is an essential part of it. I mean, any society, so there's two sides of this. I think any society which assumes that men should be able to tell women when and whether they should have children really should change. On the other hand, I'm not in the position of necessarily imposing my cultural ideas on cultures that I am not part of, but certainly as part of providing family planning to other peoples, I think women's education, women's empowerment, women's simple basic freedom to decide for themselves, because generally speaking, when women are in a position to decide for themselves, they will have smaller families. And if they're allowed to stay in school, if they are not forced to leave school, they will typically have fewer children because they, by definition, start having children later in life. There's less time to have children. But I don't think it would work. I'm not in favor of coercive measures to limit the size of families the way China has done in the past, and they still have limits, although they're not as strict as they once were. But those are the kinds of measures that you end up finding yourself forced to take when you wait too long to act. China implemented their one-child policy that they used to have that has been so decried by many on the right in this country, in response to the fact that 30-some million people are estimated to have died of famine in the early 60s in China. And China had a long history of famines, as all agricultural civilizations have had, until the fossil fuel age, which for a while has ameliorated the periodic crop failures that produce massive famine. So China essentially felt like they had no choice but to take coercive measures. And those are the kinds of choices that we will find ourselves making if we keep going the way we're going. The funny thing is that those libertarian types who oppose government intervention, government regulation, government mandates now, by putting off what would be easier actions over the last 30 years, are putting us in a position where we'll have to take more draconian measures in the future. The longer we wait, the harder it gets, the harder it's going to be.
Do you suppose that if we fail to do more humanitarian actions that you've described, that the social Darwinists will come up with a plan of their own to accomplish population reduction?
I'm not sure I have anything particularly insightful to say on that. I'm sure there are folks who are dreaming of ways. The thought that always comes to mind for me about that is that this notion that there are this elite class that has this plan to, by some chemical means or hormonal means or whatever, reduce the world's population, miss the point that the vast wealth that those elite have depends on all us worker bees out there continuing to produce wealth. So they can't really kill us off because we make possible their obscenely consumptive lifestyle. So I am not particularly persuaded that there's anything like that going on in the dark rooms behind the scenes where they're coming up with plans of how they're going to force a reduction in the world's population on this issue. I'm not persuaded that that's happening.
Early in your presentation, you put your finger on
a major issue that we think the human race is in charge of the planet. Another way of saying it is that man has dominion over the earth. Where do you suppose that notion came from?
Well, I'm going to disappoint you, Craig. I don't think it came from Genesis. I think it was expressed in Genesis, though. I think it dates back thousands of years before Genesis became an oral story. But Genesis is certainly an expression of an old idea in our culture. Again, I'm with Daniel Quinn in tracing the origins of our culture back to our agricultural revolution. The first adoption of agriculture, near as the archaeologists tell us they can see, is in what is called the Fertile Crescent, in the area of Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq. You may have found it interesting that it's called the Fertile Crescent when it's a desert now. Well, it became a desert because of the way it was farmed in large part, and climate change that we didn't directly cause may have had something to do with it as well. But that notion, I mean, one could argue not that, in my opinion, not that the idea that humanity was tasked by God. It's always dangerous when people tell you that God is behind what they are choosing to do, of course. Not that it arose with Genesis, but that Genesis was, that the Genesis story spread and was adopted by so many because it gave God's imprimatur to what we already were doing. You can always feel a lot better about yourself if you can convince yourself that what you're doing is God's will. Because what better endorsement can you have than that? And who can refute you? Anyone? Really? We're out of questions. Oh, Linda.
Would you clarify a comment that you made? I thought I heard you say that individual acts by people to do their little bit to contribute to the effort to reduce global warming don't necessarily matter. And I say that from the perspective that we just installed a very large solar system on our house. We considered it an individual act to make our a contribution.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. What I said was not that they don't matter, but what I would say about them is that the way that they really matter is not because of, say, in your case with the solar panels, the direct impact of the reduction in electricity that you will be using generated by coal or natural gas and the emissions, all the pollution that comes from that. I mean, that is a real effect of it. But except for people who are obscenely wealthy and consume vast amounts of resources, the amount that each individual has the capacity to reduce their impact while still living within the larger society, when so much of our impact is simply baked in to being part of society, is just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the overall problem. So that has actually been the message we've mostly gotten so far, is don't hold the corporations accountable. Don't regulate. Don't work on collective change. You as an individual, you eat lower on the food chain. You put solar panels up. You drive less. You bike and walk and take the bus. But that focus on the individual being the locus where action on this should be taken and must be taken, because we can't regulate the economy. We can't come together and do something like the Green New Deal that Winston talked about last Sunday, has been an obstacle to doing the big collective things, which are the only hope of making change on the scale that's necessary. Now, I'm not saying don't make individual choices, because I make individual choices all the time to reduce my impact, but don't imagine that they can create systemic change. Don't imagine that they'll ever be sufficient in scale. The ones that are really helpful are the ones that other people can see, because we are social animals and we look around us at all the people around us for cues of what is socially acceptable and socially desirable behavior. So the more people who are making visible changes, the more other people who are likely to make visible changes and real changes. And then you get this social climate which helps to create the possibility of the big systemic changes. So that's where individual change is important. But never let your desire to lower your own carbon footprint or whatever impact prevent you from showing up for the protest, for the rally, for the collective action. When it's time for those things, when they're calling on us to go to DC to protest something or wherever, burn, baby, burn that carbon. Because the amount we burn to show up for those things is just a fraction of one day's contribution to the problem. But what we may be able to accomplish by building a political mass movement for change, that could actually make a difference. The amount of carbon we put out by getting there is not going to be the tipping point between dealing with this and not dealing with this. Yes.
It seems strange to walk the way up, all the way up here in your face to ask questions. So I keep forgetting the total title, but what do you think of the carbon, whatever it is, and dividend act?
Carbon fee and dividend. I think a price signal like we would get with a carbon fee or carbon tax certainly could be useful. People do respond to price. When we look at the history in the United States here, when did Americans ever get serious about saving energy on a broad scale? It's when the price spiked, particularly the price of gasoline. I'm old enough to remember the lines at the gas pumps in the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo, the Iranian crisis, prices in gas spikes, the spikes in gas prices. So those can be, but in a broader context, the important thing about that is that for too long, for always, we haven't been paying for the real costs of burning fossil fuels. We haven't been paying for what they produce as side effects, the things that they result in that we didn't want. We wanted what the energy could do for us, but they had all these other side effects, and those have never been internalized, to use an economist term, in the prices we paid for. So we've had an unrealistic idea. If all those external costs in pollution, global warming, et cetera, were internalized, then we would see that fossil fuels are a hell of a lot more expensive than clean energy.
So I noticed in the little paper over there, and also sort of in your talk, you very much downplay the role that technology can have in these things. But it seems to me that we live in a technological society. So I was wondering if you could talk. I mean, it seems to me that the only way that we can mitigate in any meaningful way is to at least try to out-tech our problems. So I was wondering if you might be able to talk more about what you believe on the role that technology can have in fixing any part of this.
Right. So technology is a tool. And what matters with any tool is the intent of the tool user. So technology absolutely can be. I mean, let's face it, solar panels and wind turbines are technology, and I'm all in favor of solar panels and wind turbines. But the important thing is that we not imagine that technological innovation alone can solve this. It's the roots of the problem are much deeper. And so let's go back a little in time. So we had, again, as I mentioned early in my talk, we had the problem of smog in our cities because we had all these polluting cars. This massive car culture had grown up. And our cities, our major cities, were shrouded in visible smog. We've always been better at addressing the problems we could actually see, the burning rivers, the oil spills, the smoggy cities. So what was our response to that? Our response to it was not to invest in the technology of mass transit and building in a dense manner so that people could get around on foot, on bike easily. Our response was to stick catalytic converters on cars and then just keep driving more and more cars and more miles. This is what I was getting at with the mention in there of technofixes and how we've turned to technofixes. So instead of going all in on clean energy, we put scrubbers on the smokestacks of coal-fired power plants to deal with the various other pollutants, not carbon dioxide, but various other pollutants that coal plants produce. So this idea that we can put something on the end of the pipe that will make the problem go away, rather than dealing with the fundamental roots of the problem. So technology, if applied in a wise manner, will be part of solving this. But it's not by any means sufficient to deal with it. We have to change the worldview that is creating and implementing technologies first if we're going to turn this around in time.
Good wrap. Yep, all right. Thank you. Yes. The conversation can continue for a bit in the library. To get to the library, turn left as you exit the auditorium, then after the cloakroom that is on the right, move to the second marked room. First, however, our honorarium, which at least is union-made and U.S.-made, so it wasn't shipped from China using who knows how much oil. I hope you cherish it, John. Next week, Communities Creating Opportunity Director Seth Hunter will discuss the intersection of race, life expectancy, and power. It should be a really good one. I've been asked to let people know that there is a change for May 12th. We don't know for sure what's going to be occurring on May 12th, but it might have something to do with this technology issue that John has just brought up. All of you are also encouraged and welcomed to stay for the 1:15 service, 11:15 service today. Thank you very much.